So I'm going to use 2x6s for this project. I originally was going to use cedar decking boards because I had a few of them, but it turns out that I didn't have enough. So I went out and I picked up some 2x6s. These were in the 70% off pile at Home Depot, and I'm going to try and utilize these. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut them down to rough size, and then I'm going to mill them. Now, I recently sold my joiner because it's no longer there anymore, so I'm going to be using this track saw that I bought. So you guys will tell me that this isn't a track saw, but it kind of is. A track saw has a dedicated plunge saw that you plunge down and then bring across. Now this is really cool because it's not a track saw, but it's like a track saw guide. Well, it mimics a track saw, but a circular saw goes into it. So I picked up this circular saw. This is a DeWalt circular saw, and the reason why I picked up this specific one instead of something otherwise, I usually prefer Makita, but I picked up this DeWalt brand because it's a brushless motor. It's got the blade on the left-hand side, and you'll know why I like that, as stated in my beginner tools video. I like it because it's cordless, it's got the blade on the left-hand side, and this one actually has dust collection built in, so I can hook up a shop vac. So I'm gonna go do that. And that's the reason why I've always wanted a track saw, because it has dust collection built in. Regular stuff like this, if you just add a standard circular saw, it doesn't have dust collection, but this circular saw does. So this is pretty much my track saw. So the piece of wood wasn't staying on the table, so I'm going to screw it in because I cut this oversized. So I'm going to take a drill and I'm going to drill through, and then I'm going to screw it to my work table. Now there will be holes in my work table, but I cut through this work table, so it's perfectly fine. So I'm gonna take some biscuits and shove them in the slots. Well, first glue. I'm gonna run out of glue if I do this. You just want to fill those biscuit slots with gravy. A little more in here. Alright, that's probably going to overflow and squeeze the hell out of this. There we go. Squeeze out the extra gravy. Alright, so I've got all pieces planed down, they're really nice and smooth. So now since I cut the biscuit slots, because I'm going to use the biscuit joinery, I'm going to stick some biscuits into the slots. And yes, these are called biscuits. I'm going to stick them into the slot and those will align the pieces. And I've got them on this, I don't know what you'd call this, but like particle board stuff to keep it flat, and because wood glue doesn't stick to this, so that way I could glue on top of this without having to glue it to my work table. So I'm just going to glue this. So after spending eternity sanding, what I'm going to do is I noticed that the piece is warped, and I don't want to have to sand that much as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mist the board with some water, and then weigh it down flat, because this part of the concrete is dead flat, surprisingly. So I'm going to spray it with some water to soften the wood, and then I'm going to put some weights onto the thing to weigh it down to keep it flat. It has severely warped. Like you can see, it's not touching, it is very wobbly. Well, that sucked! So, the table warped. So, that means I couldn't use it anymore, because then the legs would be wobbly and so forth. So, I cut some new pieces, right? Here! So now I'm going to glue these up again. Done. So now what I gotta do is I gotta cut this, cut the edges off to clean off the edges and make it look a little bit nicer. Then I got to paint it, cut the grooves, and I'm going to use a circle jig with the router to cut the circle in. Because I usually cut circles on the table saw, but I wanted to try something a little bit different. So this time I'm going to be using the router to do it. So I just got to cut, paint, and then cut the grooves into it. Now, in case you were wondering, yes, I did use pocket holes on this, mainly because I didn't want to use biscuits and wait for the glue to dry. I just wanted something quick, and because pocket holes are really strong. So now I'm going to cut the circle, and to do this I marked the center, and what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a router with this jig that I made, which was a piece of MDF that has the router screwed to it with a screw with a pivot in the center, and that's how I'm going to cut the circle. So now I'm going to screw it into the center, as if I can find where I put the center. Then find the center, and there we go. Now I'm going to take my router and cut this entire thing out. Let's hope this works. I've never tried this before. So the reason why I didn't cut the circle all the way was because I wanted to have a reference, and also because I was impatient. But the paint is dry and I don't really like it because it looks a little uneven, but I'm just going to deal with it. Woodworkers make mistakes. And I'm going to start cutting the slots. Now I'm going to space it out close together and then go further apart. So that way it creates a little bit of like a sunset sort of look. Sort of like on Mike Montgomery's coffee table, which is where I got the inspiration for this. I'll leave the video linked down in the description, as well as a card in the corner. So I'm just going to mark it with a pen. I'm going to start at 1/4 of an inch. And I'm using my little combination square. This thing works great for this kind of stuff. And I'm just going to keep marking lines, and then I'm going to cut them with my track saw with 1/8 of an inch depth. So the router didn't cut all the way through, so now I'm going to use the jigsaw to cut this out all the way. So now I've set my miter saw to 30 degrees, so I'm going to cut off the angle, because this is going to be a triangle. So now what I got to do is line up the blade and make my cut. And there you go. Perfect 30-degree angle cut. Cool feature about this DeWalt miter saw is that it's got the little LED light right there, and what it does is it casts a shadow of the blade onto the piece of wood so I can see what I'm cutting. That's why I don't need to make a mark, because I could easily just line up the shadow line with the piece of wood right there. Super interesting feature about this miter saw, and I think it's on most other miter saws as well, like, I don't know, different brands. So I batch cut all the pieces right there. So now I'm going to cut all of them at 60-degree angles with the miter saw. So I'm going to cut one and then do that movie magic thing where I, you know, like clap or whatever it is. There we go. So now I'm going to batch cut a bunch of these angles. Now I'm either going to do the movie magic thing or I'm just going to time lapse it. So I cut all the angles. Now I got to assemble the legs. So now I'm going to glue these in place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little thing of wood glue, not too much because I don't want it squeezing out and then I have to clean that up. But only just a little. And then I'm going to use either nails or screws to fasten this in place. I haven't quite decided yet. So what I'm thinking I'm going to do is I'm going to use nails until I run out, and then I'm going to use some screws. But that's how I'm going to attach all these pieces. the gap between the router cut and the jigsaw cut, because the jigsaw cut's this one. The router cut was the perfect one. So I'm gonna use a flush trim bit in the router to smoothen it out. Now this is a really tiny flush trim bit, so I might need to go back with multiple passes.